Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Al Jazeera has released a video showing Israeli soldiers fatally shooting two unarmed Palestinians near Gaza City, then burying their bodies with a bulldozer. One of the men can be seen waving a piece of white fabric before they shoot him dead. Indiscriminate Israeli attacks continued throughout the Gaza Strip Wednesday. Musa Dahir lost his parents in an Israeli airstrike on Rafah.
I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say. I can't make sense of what happened. My parents, my father with his displaced friends who came from Gaza near the industrial area and were staying with him. They were all together when suddenly they were all gone like dust. They fled from one death and came to another. If the Security Council issues another resolution, they will hit more. For God's sake, do not pass more resolutions. That's enough. Every time they pass a resolution, they hit us more. We're all dying. My parents last night. We will be tomorrow. Others will follow. We're all on the way to death.
The Israeli raid and siege on Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City is now in its 10th day. The rights group Euromed Human Rights Monitor says at least 13 children have been killed by Israeli forces in and near Al-Shifa since the raid started. Meanwhile, local media is reporting Palestinian journalist Mohammed Abu Sakhil was shot and killed at Al-Shifa Hospital. In related news, the Palestine Red Crescent says Israel recently released 7 of its members who were detained on the raid on Al-Amal Hospital in February. The health workers, who included the director of ambulance and emergency services in Gaza, spent 47 days in prison. 8 other Red Crescent staffers are still being held. This comes as UNRWA said 171 of its workers have now been killed in Gaza. The death toll there since October 7th has now topped 32,500, including 14,000 children. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces killed at least 4 Palestinians Wednesday. 3 of them were killed in an overnight air raid.
I started screaming, and my nephew was with me. I was calling for an ambulance or a car and calling on the people to come and help us to move bodies from the ground. People came to help because the ambulance was late because the checkpoint was closed. We carried Hamza, and he was still breathing, but when we reached the ambulance, he died.
The Palestinian Health Ministry says at least 450 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. Another 4,700 have been wounded. Over 7,300 have been detained. Also in the occupied West Bank, the Israeli human rights group Looking the Occupation in the Eye said a shooting attack on a highway near the town of Al-Auja injured 2 of its activists. They were reportedly on their way to help Palestinian shepherds. A 13-year-old Israeli boy was also injured. Here in the U.S., another State Department official has publicly resigned over the Biden administration's support for Israel. Anel Sheline was a foreign affairs officer in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor who focused on promoting human rights in the Middle East and North Africa. In a piece for CNN, she writes, quote, "Whatever credibility the United States had as an advocate for human rights has almost entirely vanished since the war began." Anel Sheline will be joining us later in the broadcast. The president of the Center for American Progress, Patrick Gaspard, who is also a longtime Democratic insider and former U.S. ambassador to South Africa, blasted the Biden administration's defense of Israel's actions in Gaza. Gaspard's comments came after State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller told reporters this week the U.S. believes Israel is complying with international law. Gaspard said Miller's statement is, quote, "a gross disregard of overwhelming evidence and a dangerous precedent in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy." Meanwhile, the White House says it's working with Israel to reschedule a date for a D.C. visit by an Israeli delegation to discuss the planned invasion of Rafah. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had previously canceled the meeting after the U.S. refused to veto a UN Security Council ceasefire resolution. Elsewhere, Ireland says it'll intervene in South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. The Irish Foreign Minister, Michael Martin, said Israel's actions in Gaza constitute a, quote, blatant violation of international humanitarian law on a mass scale. In Jordan, police continue to crack down on thousands of protesters who've been demonstrating near the Israeli embassy in Amman for 3 days. Protesters could be heard chanting betrayal as they call on Jordan to cancel its deals with Israel.
Our message has been a message of the Jordanian popular movement since the beginning of October 7th and before that. We are asking the Jordanian government to cancel the Wadi Araba peace treaty with Israel and all its annexes that we believe harm Jordanian national interests. This requires us to stand with the choices of the Palestinian people who are facing an aggression by the Zionist entity, the American administration, and the European West.
In Baltimore, rescue workers recovered the bodies of 2 victims of the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse. The men were identified as 35-year-old Alejandro Hernandez Fuentes, originally from Mexico, and 26-year-old Dorlian Roniel Castillo Cabrera from Guatemala. Another 4 workers are still missing and presumed dead in the river. All 6 victims were immigrant overnight construction workers. The National Transportation Safety Board said the investigation into the cargo ship's collision with the bridge could take 1 to 2 years to complete. President Biden has vowed to direct federal funds to pay for the entire cost of the bridge's reconstruction. In Alabama, a Democrat has flipped a seat in the state legislature after running on abortion rights and preserving access to IVF, in vitro fertilization, in what Democrats hope is a bellwether ahead of November. Marilyn Land said of her victory, quote, Alabama women and families sent a clear message that will be heard in Montgomery and across the nation. Our legislature must repeal Alabama's no-exceptions abortion ban, fully restore access to IVF, and protect the right to contraception, she said. Voting rights advocates in Pennsylvania are expressing alarm after a federal appeals court ruled undated mail-in ballots should not be counted even if they arrive on time. The ACLU said this could result in thousands of Pennsylvania voters losing their votes. The Republican National Committee praised the ruling. Meanwhile, in Montana, the state Supreme Court has struck down 4 Republican laws aimed at restricting the vote, including one which would have largely ended same-day voter registration. The 3 white men who chased down and killed Ahmaud Arbery in 2020 asked a federal appeals court Wednesday to toss out their hate crimes convictions. The 3 convicted murderers say prosecutors did not prove they targeted Arbery, who they shot and killed while he was out for a jog because he was black. During the trial of William Bryan and father and son Greg and Travis McMichael, prosecutors shared dozens of racist text messages and social media posts from the men in the months and years before the murder of 25-year-old Ahmaud Arbery. Ahmaud's father, Marcus Arbery, responded to the news Wednesday.
The evidence just too strong against old man. I don't care what them lawyers said. The evidence was just too strong. And me and my family, we just had to be strong to just sit back. We know everything all right. Because I'm telling you, the evidence was just too strong against those 3 men.
Donald Trump lashed out at New York Judge Juan Merchan and the judge's daughter just hours after the judge imposed a gag order on Trump ahead of his criminal hush money trial next month. On his Truth Social platform, Trump called Judge Merchan a hater and accused him of being biased and conflicted. In response to the partial gag order, Trump claimed Merchan was, quote, wrongfully attempting to deprive me of my First Amendment right to speak out against the weaponization of law enforcement, unquote. The gag order does not technically shield Merchan from public statements by Trump. Former Connecticut Senator and vice presidential candidate Joe Lieberman has died at the age of 82 after a fall. Lieberman was a leading backer of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. He also helped kill the public option in the Affordable Care Act and fought efforts to expand Medicare eligibility. In 2000, he became the first Jewish vice presidential nominee on a major party ticket when he ran as Al Gore's running mate. In 2008, he endorsed Republican Senator John McCain for president over Barack Obama. In his memoir, McCain said he was sorry he didn't choose Lieberman as his vice presidential running mate over Sarah Palin. The Phoenix City Council has approved a new ordinance to protect many workers from extreme heat. Phoenix is the hottest city in the country. Contractors working with the city will be required to provide cooling breaks, cold water, and air conditioning. Meanwhile, in Florida, the Republican-led state legislature recently passed a bill barring municipalities in Florida from adopting any local measures to protect workers from extreme heat. In Argentina, a court has convicted 11 former officials of crimes against humanity for committing atrocities against over 600 people during the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 83. The victims included transgender women, high school students, prisoners who gave birth in captivity and whose babies were taken from them. The court ruled the former military, police, and government officials were involved in forced disappearances, torture, rape, and murder at secret torture centers on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. On Sunday, thousands of Argentines gathered in Buenos Aires to remember the victims of the military dictatorship.
Today, some families here in Argentina are still searching for their children. The idea is that every March 24th, we should remember that date so we don't repeat those mistakes. A people that has a memory does not repeat those mistakes.
This all comes as Argentina's new far-right president, Javier Milei, faces renewed criticism for downplaying dictatorship-era atrocities. In Indonesia, 13 soldiers have been arrested after video emerged showing them torturing a man at a military outpost in West Papua. The Indonesian military also issued a rare apology for the incident. According to Amnesty International, the man who was tortured later died. In Russia, the death toll from last week's concert hall attack has risen to 143. Around 80 people remain hospitalized after surviving the worst terror attack in Moscow in decades. The arrest of 4 Tajik nationals has sparked an increase in attacks on Central Asian migrants in Moscow and other cities. The embassy of Tajikistan in Russia has warned its citizens to stay home if possible. And UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for reparations for the transatlantic slave trade to, quote, help overcome generations of exclusion and discrimination. Guterres made the statement on the UN International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.